I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture.
I'm here with Adam DeVille. Hello, Adam. Nice to see you.
And you?
Now, Adam is Director of Humanities and Associate Professor of Theology at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Editor-in-Chief of Logos, which is a journal of Eastern Christian studies. And I'm interested in him because I'll just get the book up here, because he wrote this book, which is Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, Ridding the Church of Abuses of Sex and Power. Now, this was given to me, this book was handed to me, actually, Adam, by a priest locally where I am in California, who'd read an article I'd written on the organization of the parish, which on the face of it, according to, I go to a Melkite church, actually, and our bishop is pushing what he says is a model that comes out of the Acts of the Apostles, and it very much pushing lay involvement, according to people's gifts, and people have an understanding of their roles. And it wasn't about the current crisis in the church, the abuse crisis, which is terrible. I don't want to diminish that at all. But what I was interested in this book is the fact that you think that the same, if I've understood this right, the same problems that the church has in retaining and involving people, and also, if I might say, just even if people are coming to the parishes, that there is a genuine sense of the faith present in a parish. The parishes are vibrant. So that's what I'm frustrated about. And you're describing this and saying, well, actually, this goes all the way to the top or all the way to the center, and all of these things are interconnected. So why don't I hand over to you? Perhaps you, first of all, before we get to the book, just tell us a little bit about your story and where you're coming from as a Christian on this, just so we have a sense of you.
Yeah, I grew up and was heavily involved in the Anglican Church of Canada throughout the late 1980s and the 1990s, particularly in southern Ontario, where my family still resides. And I got involved through that with the Canadian Council churches and the World Council churches, and did a lot of ecumenical work. So I was exposed early on to the whole panoply of Christian traditions, starting with Anglicanism, but certainly with Catholicism, with Orthodoxy, and with the Oriental Orthodox churches a little bit. And I think I quickly realized through that experience that when Pope John Paul II started using this phrase somewhere in the early 90s, I think it was, about a gift exchange, that Christians of other traditions had things to offer each other. But in a selective and a discerning way. It's not just, well, if you do this, then we must therefore adopt it, right? So we can look alike. It was a kind of a sense that, no, there are certain things that other Christians might have a particular strength at, or certain insights that we might not be as aware of. So let's start thinking about that. And then I spent some time teaching in Eastern Europe, and kind of fell in love with the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, of which I'm a part. And so I, have had this experience within the Christian East, but in some ways as a son of the Christian West, trying to sort of say what are the gifts that we all have to offer each other, because everybody struggles, right? And everybody's got problems, and are there ways we can help each other? So that's kind of been part of my long-standing experience.
And the thing that came through when I read it is that you're certainly not saying, we in the East, we've got the answers, we've got all this.
Right.
You're acknowledging that it's exactly as you described, that there are difficulties everywhere, but there are strengths everywhere, and that's the spirit with which you come to it. That's my sense anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I'm glad to hear that, because I really see myself in some ways as kind of an enemy of any form of triumphalism or romanticism. Some people, and I went through this a little bit, if I'm honest, after I entered the Catholic Church in 97, you sometimes have that kind of convert zeal in which you think everything is wonderful here and I rubbish everything that I've left behind. But I fortunately, I think I grew out of that. And I realized that, nobody has it perfectly mastered. And we need to have the humility to be able to recognize when we need help.
Yes. And of course, the one thing that we have in the church is not a secret of institutional governance.
Right.
It's God.
Yeah.
That's the. So I just, because I wrote a blog post on this, and I got a lot of comments coming back. People saying, this sounds like the Lutherans, or this sounds like the Anglican Church, and I say, well, it might be, but that doesn't mean we're going to end up like the Anglicans, because we have a key difference here.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and I've said that in the new book as well, that the key difference, or among the key differences for Catholics, is that we have a clearly defined deposit of faith. We have a universal catechism. I mean, there are standards, and Anglicanism has chosen, by and large, not to go down that route, which I think has contributed to some of its problems. The fact that the Catholic Church, has defined things doesn't mean that it doesn't have problems, as we all know. But I think it is certainly a very distinct advantage.
Right. So why don't you just summarize your arguments? And we will make the connection early on with the clerical abuse. I don't want to diminish that at all. But my focus in this is the one that brought me into your book when somebody handed it to me, because I was interested in parish reorganization. And it made, as a lay person, I don't like wagging my fingers and bishops and saying you should be doing this. I just think, what can I do and be positive and constructive? And your book is telling me what I can do, I think, as a lay person, as part of when you describe the underlying problem. So you just give us a summary of your thesis, if you like.
Yeah, thank you. That's good to hear, because that's really what I was trying to do and write the book, is to sort of say to people, here's a framework within which you can see yourself doing something, right? A way in which we can begin to think our way and act our way out of parts of this problem. And part of my frustration in writing the book was people, I think even still today, are kind of spinning their heels in denouncing certain things and expecting that, well, if we get a new pope or a different bishop, or we get rid of certain clergy, then the problem's solved. That's not the whole case by any means. So yeah, I wanted people to feel like, here's something that we can practically do. So I start locally by design, to be able to say to people, we talk about the church as this big abstract institution around the world, but for most of us, the church is what we experience on Sunday morning, right? The church is when we get our kids baptized, we're probably married, and we receive the Eucharist, and we go to confession. We might have kids in the school, we might sing in the choir, all that stuff. So let's start at the parish, because that's really where it's real for most people. And let's recover a really strong sense of people being involved in the parish, including parish governance, because there's no theological justification for the current system that says the pastor has a monopoly on all power in the parish. I mean, there's no historical or theological reason for that. And so that's kind of what I wanted to start with, was to be able to say to people, you have a role to play by virtue of your baptism and the sacraments of initiation. And you have a legitimate right to play that role. You have there is no good case for you being excluded from having a legitimate voice and vote in the major decisions of the parish.
I'm just going to interject one moment there. I can hear people already, alarm bells ringing for certain people.
Yes.
We'll come back to the objections that. I'm going to throw these at you later, but
good.
I just want to say that this is not justifying the terrible experiences of parish councils that many pious Christians, I mean pious in a good sense, will worry that this will sound to some people like you're pushing something which we know produces bad experiences as well. So just to reassure people, stay with us. We're going to come back to that.
Yeah. No, and that's a very good point, because I've seen that up close. If you spend time in the Orthodox world or the Eastern Christian world, as I have, you see that. You see parishes where what you basically swap out is one monopoly for another, and one set of problems for another. So instead of the priest being the all-powerful, generalissimo, who controls everything, you have kind of a faction, in the parish council. It may be some old family or some old money or a particular ethnic group or something. So my proposal is to say, no, we're not having monopolies by anybody. We have to look at the ways we set things up so that we say there are certain areas where we come together and hold each other accountable. It's not the swapping out of one monopoly or other. So I'll give you an example. Example I use in the book. Let's say that you need a change in leadership in the parish. One of the things we've been hearing now for more than 30 years is that priests who are a problem, whether it's with alcohol or sex abuse or financial mismanagement, are often just kind of silently yanked out. Nobody's told why, and then somebody else is just as silently dropped in. And I said, there's no reason for that. There's no reason for the bishop to be able to do that. And here's where I draw on the examples of the Armenian Church, some of the other Orthodox churches, and the Anglican Church that I grew up in, to say, when it comes to a decision like that, it's much better for everybody to have the parish council and the bishop working together. And so the bishop comes to the parish council and says, I call up the chair of the parish council. I've been alerted to a problem with Father so-and-so. We need to meet. Okay, so we get in the same room. You discover and disclose what's been going on. Bishop says, I want to move it. Parish council says, yes, we think you're right. Go ahead. Right? Bishop then comes back and says, okay, I've got a priest for you in mind. Here's what we know about him. Here's his personnel file. You can see there's no issues in there. He's not being shuffled around, what do you think? And the parish council has a legitimate right to say, we think you'd be a great fit, or, we have some concerns, and then allow them to come to some kind of consensus. So that's one example where, as I say, the underlying principle through the whole book is nobody has a monopoly on decision making, because the current system does that, and I think that's been a big part of the problem.
Okay, so let's go up, or I don't know whether it's down, through the hierarchical structure, finishing last but not least with the Pope and the papacy. And you've got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and the papacy, I think, has really become too large and has taken over too much in ways that were certainly not historical, and I don't even think these are ways that were intended. Part of the problem, part of my argument, is that we operate in the shadow of the 19th century, which for Catholics is not over. It's the very long 19th century.
Yes.
That in fact you could argue starts with the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And I think we got ourselves into an emergency situation where we felt like, well, we're going to have revolutionaries attacking the church. We're going to have Napoleon forcing the sacking of the entire French episcopate. We've got to have a super strong centralized pope who can basically do everything. And as that's developed, I think it's really paralyzed the church. It's prevented people from saying, well, it's not my problem. There's an article today you may have seen just in the Washington Post about the Bishop of West Virginia, Michael Brandes, who's was forced out last year. And there's a paper trail in Rome going back to at least 2013, 5 years, about the abuses this guy was committing, because everybody kept saying, well, we can't do anything, just go to Rome. And that's the problem, and that's the default, I think, in the church today. Go to Rome, right? It's up to the Pope. The Pope's got to do this. And so part of what I try to do in the book is say, wait a minute, there's no reason for that. It's a very recent development, 150 years. And we are now seeing that it doesn't work. And so we have to say, wait a minute, what things can other structures in the church, other levels of the church do that Rome does not need to do? So this isn't a shoving Rome aside, but it's saying we need a proper devolution here And the person I'm echoing perhaps most strongly on this is Joseph Ratzinger. This is not stuff that I just made up. I mean, starting back, somewhere around 1970, Father Ratzinger, as he was then, was arguing, saying there's way too much happening in Rome that's done badly because Rome is overworked. We need to have more robust local structures in the church to do things like hold bishops accountable. So when I argue that, I'm arguing something that he and a lot of other Catholics have been arguing.
And again, this is going to worry some.
Yes.
The people I immediately think of the First Vatican Council, the crystallization, if you like, in words of the ideas of the primacy and the infallibility of the Pope. And I'm going to throw a summary of what I think you're saying to you, and then you can modify it or correct me. But again, you're not in any way arguing against the decision of that council.
No.
So no one here is seeking to go against Catholic teaching, the decisions of the councils.
Exactly.
The problem is that this has become first misinterpreted and seen to mean something which it doesn't.
Yeah.
And the other point is that this was not something that was new in the church. It was actually an articulation of what had always been and what had always been known. What did change is the perception. And you mentioned Cardinal Ratzinger as was. The same concern prior to this was expressed by Newman in England. And so these are great figures who love the church, and it's nobody is saying there's anything wrong with the decision of the Vatican Council. Nobody here, anyway.
Right. Yeah.
But the difficulty is the perception, and this idea that you can't even criticize the Pope on anything. That if you do somehow, you're being disloyal to the church. And I love the stuff you wrote about the new cult of personality. The person of the Pope, rather than his sort of teaching role. So do you want to just come back at me on that a little bit?
No, and that's very good, and thank you again for clarifying that. Vatican I is obviously established teaching. What I do in the book is sort of say Vatican I has to be translated into more practical terms. When we talk about universal jurisdiction, for example, that term has never really been defined. To the extent that we define it, we do so usually in codes of canon law. And codes of canon law can change. And there's room to maneuver there. So, nobody's disputing the role. Again, an awareness of the Christian East, or certainly the Anglican Communion, would say, we don't want to gut the papacy, because then you've got the problems we've seen in the Anglican Communion with essentially a powerless Archbishop of Canterbury, and the problems we see of a related type in Orthodoxy with the Ecumenical Patriarch, constantly at loggerheads with the Moscow Patriarch, among others. So you need the Pope to have a clear role, and you need him to be that guy who can really sort of, break through the log jams and take decisions where the local church is paralyzed or, got some problems. But you don't need him to be the default guy to do everything. And unfortunately, I think that's become particularly at a psychological level, the way that most Catholics relate to the church. It's, what does the Pope do? What did the Pope say today? What was the latest statement? And that's basically what we go with. And to as you say, to challenge any of that is like, well, you're being disloyal. That's not Catholic behavior. That's cultic behavior. I mean, that's not helpful behavior.
And what has happened is that instead of in persona Christi, the bishop has become in persona papacy or something.
Yeah.
Everything is participating in this wrong view of the Pope.
Right. Exactly.
Right the way down.
Exactly.
And the problem is ours as much as theirs.
Nobody gets off on this. Like nobody gets off the hook on this because we've allowed that to develop and not challenged a lot of it. And that's a problem in itself, is our willingness to sort of sit back and say, That's his problem, let him deal with it. Instead of saying, wait a minute, if the church is a communion of all the baptized, do we not have some role to play here, rather than constantly deferring to him, which in practice means that a lot of stuff doesn't get done, because he's only one man, and he can't do very much by virtue of not having enough time. We saw this last November with the American bishops meeting, and again last month when they met again, this kind of sense that, well, we can't do anything, we've got to wait for the Pope to do something. Well, my response to that is to say there are more than 5,000 bishops in the world today. There's no possible way you can expect the Pope to be supervising all of them. There's got to be another way of doing that.
So we have this situation where everyone that sits back and waits for the Pope to come in and save them, and they might grumble or complain and say that they're being disloyal, but nevertheless, it's all the two sides of the same coin. Because everybody's sitting back and waiting for the Pope to do that. Now, before we get to the impact changing this could have on reinvigorating parish life and therefore drawing people back into the churches, let's look at the way you introduce this subject, which is linking this in a psychological argument, in a sense, why this situation has led to the abuses of power, and particularly the sexual abuse crisis. Maybe you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think what we've done in the Catholic world, in some respects, is to more or less turn the Pope into an idol. Now, that might sound like an outrageous statement to make, but if you read the Catechism, it has a very interesting series of paragraphs on idolatry, and it says, idolatry is a perennial temptation for Christians. I think a lot of us, we hear the word idolatry and we think, well, I'm not one of the tribes of Israel out in the desert with a golden cow, so I'm good. I don't have to worry about this. Well, I think idolatry is much more subtle than that, and often operates in a kind of a semi or an unconscious way. And we don't fully realize that we're making idols out of things. And so part of what I try to do in the first chapter in the book is to sort of say, I think we've made an idol out of the papacy. And we have people like Sigmund Freud to help us out here. And again, I know that's a hugely controversial name for a lot of people, but I've been reading Freud for 25 years, and there are parts of Freud that I think are very useful for Christians. And his whole life project, in some ways, as Adam Phillips has summed it up, is to be against forms of idolatry and illusion. And so what I try to argue in the first chapter is we've made an idol out of the Pope, and we act. And how do we know that? Well, look at the way we act. In the face of this papacy, we become passive. We don't challenge. We just allow it to tell us what to do and what to think, and we behave accordingly. And so part of what I'm trying to say is let's wake up and be more self-aware of how we have allowed the papacy to kind of invade our conscious Catholic mind, and become this central figure that sort of crowds everything else out. So that when we say, wait a minute, there are other ways of governing the church, for example, people assume that's impossible. The papacy is so large that it kind of crowds out everything else, and we just figure it has to be this way because this figure dominates us to such an extent that we lose our sort of critical capacity to say, should it be this way?
And I can use a bit of psychobabble that probably doesn't come from Freud. What you describe is a sort of codependency.
Well, yep. And you see that.
Who are going to take advantage of that, and it attracts Catholics who allow them to do so, and we end up in the mess that we have.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think, the last two American bishops' meetings have been very clear examples of this kind of unhealthy codependency. Bishops say, well, we can't do anything because we've got to wait for Rome to act. Well, Rome doesn't have time or interest in a lot of these cases to do that. And so what you get is this kind of back and forth that says, well, I can't do anything, my hands are tied, right? Only Rome can do that, and then Rome doesn't act. So that becomes, and there's a long history of that. If you look at some of the early debates in the plenary councils of the 19th century in the United States, you get a lot of bishops who are pretty open about saying, you know what, we need to show our support to, the beleaguered prisoner of the Vatican, Pius IX, by letting him appoint new bishops for the U.S. Previously they've been elected by the councils here, but we need to show our support for this poor guy because he's being hemmed in by Garibaldi and the Italian revolutionaries. So let's let him appoint American bishops from now on, which of course conveniently means that if he appoints a dud, it's his problem. It's not ours, right? We don't have to deal with this guy. We say, well, that's not my appointee. I didn't bring him in. So you get that kind of unhealthy codependency, I think, and it's still there. I think it's still there today.
And just for people who might worry about the mention of Freud, I'm probably one of those people. You anticipate this, and some people are going to react against it.
Yep.
What I would say is that I'll take your word for it, that you can use Freud to make this argument, but I don't think it needs that. I think it makes sense, what you're saying,
Sure.
common sense level as well, actually.
Yeah. No, that's good to hear. Thank you.
But really, if you give people power, it attracts people who like to make use of it. And it creates an unhealthy relationship. And
it does.
What's happened recently, you described some of the reactions of the councils of bishops and the re-emergence of this crisis in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, just at a personal level, I always just thought that what we were experiencing generally in the church, everything that's happened in the last 60 years or something, where it's really become obvious there are difficulties, that it was a sort of benign neglect, that we just, somehow the situation evolved. Everyone was well-intentioned. They're fighting against a sort of institutional inertia. Maybe they're not well-formed. One or two mavericks, maybe, fiddling with the liturgy, manipulating in Rome. You hear these stories. But now, I no longer believe that. I think we're suffering from a deliberate attempt, not only the crisis, the sexual abuse crisis, is in a sense almost a byproduct of the main mission, in a sense, which is to subvert the teachings of the church. I believe there are people, and many more than I previously thought, who are not just sitting back and letting it happen. They're the architects of what has happened.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of group thing that has grown out of this psychology that you describe.
Yeah. I think I'm very much with you on that, and I've shifted on that too. When I first wrote about sex abuse in the church in 1992, because there was a big report that came out in Canada that year, and I've kind of been watching my own reaction and reactions of others now for 27 years, I guess. And I think, as you just said, a lot of us, and I was one of them until recently, felt like, there's a few on the fringe, a few crazies. We get rid of them and it's smooth sailing. I don't think that anymore. And what I've been struck by, especially over the last year since the McCarrick news broke, especially, is the number of people who are starting to say, I don't buy that either anymore. I don't think it's just, we got to get rid of a couple of bad guys and we're fine. I think there's a bigger issue going on here, and it does. It's a moment in the church where I think we've got to be sort of firing on all cylinders. It's got to be structural reform. It's got to be a renewed ascesis. A renewed ascetical life. A very different understanding of fatherhood. Different ways of exercising authority and clarity about what the church teaches. I think it's a package deal.
And I think there are things we can do. I think your book is not offering doom and despair. It's offering hope, because what it's telling me as a layperson, I don't like, as I mentioned, wagging my fingers at priests.
Yes. Yep.
I've got very strong views on the liturgy. I like the liturgical movement, But on the whole, I don't like to be in a position where I'm spending my whole time picking the priest up on details of what he's doing, what he is.
Yeah.
So I would rather think, well, what can I do? So where can I have an influence liturgically? Well, it's in the domestic church. It's how I, as a member of the parish, participate personally in the liturgy. Those are things that I can change and focus on in myself, regardless almost of what is happening front and center. And so I'd like to get into that. But the one comment I want to make before we do that is that I know that people will be concerned about what you're saying, particularly pious and traditionally minded Catholics who have the best interests of the church at heart. Right. I'm not worried about the liberals who don't care, who push those to one side. But the point that struck me is that what you're describing will allow the good to flourish. So when I think about where the successes have been in the last 60 years in the church, it has been where the lay people have taken responsibility to do things, and they've been free of the control of the bishops, actually. So think of the Catholic colleges, which are strong. These are new projects that have come up, and really lay people have taken the lead. I think of the beacon parishes and churches. And in some ways, it's sad that there are single parishes that are known throughout the world as being beacons for liturgy, and it's, because everywhere else is a desert. But so influential in my life was the Brompton Oratory. Now, the structure of the oratorians is such that they have this autonomy, not only from central control within the Oratorian organisation. These are the oratories of St. Philip Neri. But also a certain autonomy from the local bishop. Once they're in there, they respect the bishop, but they can do what they want to a certain degree. Some of them went south with with everything else. But the London Oratory, the Birmingham Oratory, the Toronto Oratory, which immediately come to mind, they took advantage of that, and they have an influence way beyond their local parish. As a result of this, and because the good will act. And so I anything that encourages that, I think, is a good thing. And I think that's what you're describing there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I had spent some wonderful days in the late 90s with the Toronto Oratory. And in fact, my first visit was right after their Church of Holy Family burned down. And so I heard the kind of the backstory about negotiation with, the Sacred Architectural Commission of the Archdiocese for what they wanted to rebuild. And because of that autonomy, they got away with a much more beautiful church, frankly, and a much more traditionally appointed church than they were going to have foisted upon them. And so, those kind of models, I think, are important. And I just had an interesting email from Father Bob Wild about 2 weeks ago with Madonna House, which is an interesting lay-led apostolate in the Ottawa Valley, with Catherine Doherty being the foundress of that. And they have a very interesting structure, too. And the other piece that was in my mind as I'm writing that chapter on the parish is, Pope Benedict in Summorum Pontificum of 2007, when he kind of, as I would put it, strikes a blow for local liturgical freedom by saying that, parishes, stable communities who want to use the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite can do so. And in essence, sort of cutting out a lot of the bureaucratic control on that had been in place. That's really the way to go, I think, because you're right, those kinds of initiatives, and we have those parishes in the East, I'm thinking, for example, of Annunciation of the Mother of God in Homer Glen, south of Chicago, which is a real beacon for Eastern Catholics in the Midwest. St. Elias outside of Toronto, and Brampton, where I was married. If you have the people freed up to do things, they can do wonderful things. And that's very much part of what I was thinking of in that chapter, particularly for liturgy, because I come out of, as I mentioned at the outset, I come out of a wonderful Anglican liturgical experience, the prose of Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer and the English choral tradition. You know, and we've got to have ways of being able to preserve that without everything being sort of centralized and controlled by, you know, so-called experts with their committees, because I think we know how that story turns out.
Yes, and so while the horror story, which everyone is aware of, the newly ordained priest with great ideas, somehow he's managed to get through the seminaries, get his head down, secretly the liturgical traditionalist, comes into the parish, or let's say not newly ordained, but new appointed pastor, wants to implement things, and then immediately the parish, the choir that's been there for 30 years, singing, you know, strumming their guitars, writes to the bishop, and the bishop just terrified of anybody complaining about anything, supports this parish community. Now, my thought is that that might still happen.
Yes.
The point about this is that when you give freedom to people, they can use it badly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's not, otherwise it's not freedom.
That's right.
But the greater freedom, of course, is to use it well, and you can't have one without the other. That's the nature of a Christian society, actually.
That's right. Yeah. And if you end up restricting things, as we often do, then I think what you get is a kind of a mediocre, mediocre in the middle sort of thing, that everybody has to kind of hew to some sort of rough standard, and nobody wants to be the tall poppy that gets lobbed off because, you stand out because you've got too much, whatever, Latin or incense or something.
Yes. So, as lay people, perhaps you could just give us a little bit about your sense of the organization. And I think, again, stressing this point that each grouping of people and each person has a sense of what their role is within this. And it's going to rely on that. We're trusting grace, really, that this will harmonize in some parishes. So we can see that it'll cause problems. But could you just perhaps describe that parish structure that you envisage and what we as lay people can do?
The premise I operate from is an ancient one, but it might strike some people as a little scary because they don't know the tradition that far back. Person I draw on is Nicholas Afanassiev, one of the great ecclesiologists of the 20th century. In fact, he's the only Orthodox person cited in the documents of Vatican II. Afanassiev talks about what he calls the three orders within the church: the laïque, which is this term for the laity, clerics, and hierarchs. That corresponds, in fact, to how the Anglican Church of my upbringing was structured, and it corresponds to how parts of the Armenian Church are structured today, and some of the other Eastern churches. And so the idea is that we have to work together. Nobody has a monopoly here to be able to inflict or enforce their will on the rest of the church. So when it comes again to the parish, for example, the pastor and the parish council have to at least talk these things through. There's no guarantee it's going to work out perfectly at any point. But to be open with each other and to say, you know what, I'm thinking that we need to make some changes here. Our organist is retiring, or the organ just died or something, we'd like to make some changes to the music, or whatever it is. And to be able to come to some kind of consensus and have this discussion and find a way to agree broadly and move forward. The big ones where I think that has to happen, the one is, as I mentioned earlier, about the change of pastoral leadership. That has to be a cooperative discussion between the bishop and the council. The other one is money. And we're seeing this, this has been a perennial problem in the church, and we're seeing this today again with pastors and bishops who have exclusive say over money, how quickly that can be abused. And so what I propose in the book is that the pastor and the parish every year have to agree upon a budget, and they have to hold themselves to that budget. And that's true at the diocesan level as well, as a way of forcing transparency and accountability that really means something. And so we come together to agree for, the 2020 fiscal year. Here's how much money we're going to spend. Here's what we're going to spend it on. Here's where it's going to come from. And at the end of that fiscal year, we have a transparent accounting of the books to say, you know what, we were over on this line, we were under on this line, but here's what the budget looks like a year later. So you try as far as possible to cut off, the abuse, cut off the slush funds, cut off bishops that think they can just hand, envelopes of cash to each other, no questions asked, pay for dinner all the time, hire private jets, booze, flowers, the whole bit, all the stuff we've been hearing in West Virginia. So you've got to structure things in a way that at the parish and the diocesan level, people know where the money's going and where it's being spent.
Right. I'm just going to tell you about the parish that I go to, St. Elias, which is in Melcombe.
Yep.
It's a very small mission parish, really, with Father Sebastian Coe, who is our pastor, who teaches for Pontifex University. Some will be aware of him. And so the bishop came and gave us this talk, Bishop Nicholas. He visits many of the parishes. He spends half his year traveling around the country visiting the parishes. So it's a geographically large diocese, but actually small enough that he can come and be pastoral at a personal level. And he talked about the organisation of the parish, and he said, based upon his reading of the Acts of the Apostles, I don't know if it's his personal or he's drawing on a tradition of the reading, you have certain roles. The priest is in charge of the liturgy, and you have education, organisation of social and sort of hospitality. There's a meal after every liturgy, which we organise, and Father Sebastian is sort of putting people in place. But I got my email last week saying you signed up for the main course, just to remind from another parishioner to remind you that you're going to bring some chicken. And it's okay, fine. That's what I volunteered for. And education, so that there's somebody who's doing the Sunday school afterwards, and they work in cooperation with Father Sebastian, and everybody has a role. And it's understood actually that if you want to be part of the parish, you contribute in one of these these roles: liturgical, educational, social, and I can't remember the other, but there were 4 of them. Okay, but the way that Bishop Nicholas was describing is that most of us, our religious community is the parish, and therefore we have probably natural charisms that will come in some way under these broad headings where we're meant to be. And the principle is always there that you get more out of something the more you put in, and so if you discover where you're meant to be participating, then it works. And so we have now a parish that might get, well, when I first went there, it maybe used to get 40 people a week. It's now up to about 75. Okay. Father Sebastian says that the maximum he wants is about 150, and after that you send off another mission, because
that's smart.
It undermines community. Through this, we already have 3 or 4 who are training for the diaconate.
Okay.
As they immediately, every guy that comes in is what are you doing? What do you do? They're asked what role they can play within the parish. I'm trying to be a cantor, and I may end up being ordained as a reader. We'll see. I don't know. But I'm learning all the chants, and I'm taking my instruction. And so, and everybody is playing their part. And regardless of the size, this is pulling people together, and you just see it happening. And it becomes, therefore, also the centre of your spiritual life. It has a whole different meaning. You feel like this is the thing that drives what I do during the week. I pray the liturgy of the hours, and I'm very interested in trying to, part of what I do with the Way of Beauty is trying to encourage lay people to be good lay people in the parish. So my Benedict option, if you like, is actually go to your, it all begins with us. It's not go anywhere. You look at yourself and say, what am I giving? And then you become part of the community.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're describing is really a principle for the whole church, which Bishop Nicholas was describing for Little Saint Elias in Los Gatos, California. So
yeah. I sent him, just as a footnote, I sent him the manuscript in draft, and he was about halfway through it. He was going to write a blurb for it, but the publisher's dedeadline he couldn't meet because he told me he was in California for a couple of weeks.
With us, okay.
He may well have been, yeah. No, he's. I really like him, and I think he's got that vision from my. I've only interacted with him a little bit, but I mean, what you just described, I think, is absolutely the vision, and I've seen that in other Eastern Catholic parishes where it works, and I think that has to be really held up for others today, because I think we keep hearing these headlines, I know I do, about people, a massive epidemic of loneliness and isolation and all this kind of stuff. The real advantage I think a lot of Eastern parishes have is we're not huge, and that's very attractive, as well as the dynamics you just described about pulling people in to use their gifts and so on. And when that works, it's a marvel to behold.
Yeah, and the mission, the source of the mission, is not the bishop. Right. Parachuting a stranger in.
Yep.
Los Gatos, at one point we're thinking, because I said, look, I'll learn to be a cantor. I'm an hour's drive away, but I'll do it on the condition that, can we get a priest here in Berkeley? Because I want to have a church like this here.
Yep.
And he said, okay, we'll try. But that mission will come from St. Elias, an hour away.
Okay.
Somehow it'll be coordinated in conjunction with that. And clearly the bishop has a role, and I don't know precisely how it'll happen. Yeah. But that's the idea, that you work with your strengths, and they become the source of goodness, if you like, within the church as a whole.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think you're right that so much of all of these problems are interconnected. And the irony is that Vatican II, in terms of its documents and discussion, was really a counterbalance to Vatican I, I think, in the direction that you're describing.
Yeah.
The disasters that we had were an imposition of something which, people will know my view. There's nothing really to do with what Vatican II was saying.
Right.
The point in the context of this discussion, it was a centrally imposed solution in which nobody had any say at all. Everyone, or they didn't say. That was the point. That people were saying, "Well, I'm not so sure about this, but I guess the bishop's doing it, so I suppose we'll try and go with it." And
Vatican II, is I mean, it is just rife with irony, and especially the so-called synod that gets created by the Pope unilaterally, in 1965. I mean, there's all kinds of paradoxes and ironies like that. What is supposed to be a balance to the centralizing tendency of Vatican I think in some ways reinforces the worst tendencies of centralization after Vatican I. And I think we're both thinking of the same example, the liturgy. What happens after the liturgy, ostensibly in the name of the council, is a massive imposition of centralized authority by people like Paul VI, we're now realizing, who weren't exactly on top of all the files. So it's a very strange thing. At the same time, I defend it because I think what it says about the Eastern churches and in some of the other documents is absolutely necessary and very, very true. But like all councils, it's a mess afterwards.
The picture that I've got is that the impact that the council had on the Eastern churches, which it's almost gone unnoticed because everyone's worried about, is actually what was intended, because the Eastern churches were more set up naturally to adopt this. What you see is an invigoration of the Eastern traditions in the Eastern Catholic Church, which may well see them, therefore, having greater influence on the church as a whole, because that is where the strength is very often in the church. It's not not the only places, but certainly it's redressed the balance. I think there's a new self-confidence, I would say,
Yes,
in Catholic Church as a result of this, and directly as a result of being encouraged to look to their traditions in sort of vague statements, but nevertheless, in the Eastern Church, they were able to understand what that meant. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and you probably know this history as well. I mean, the role of the outsized role of the Melkites at the council was very significant in sort of helping the West to be able to say, oh yeah, there are other ways of doing things. There are other ways of celebrating Catholic life and Catholic liturgy other than this kind of one model that we've operated with. And so I think I think the East does have a lot to be able to offer the Western Church. Again, not in a spirit of triumphalism, because the East has problems like we all do, but a way of saying, you can be traditional, you can have beautiful liturgy, you can have strong parish communities, hold the line on this stuff without feeling like you're somehow selling out to the world. I think that's still kind of a bridge that a lot of people in the Western Church are struggling to get across.
I want to close. Before I do, I'm throwing this at you, and I didn't mention this before, so I hope it doesn't knock you for six, as we'd say in England, to use a cricketing analogy. But imagine we're in a parish where that there's no. You might have a cluster of people who are interested in what you're saying, and they're asking the question, okay, what can I do? I don't think it's worth my even going to the pastor. He's he's ordering breaking bread. Everything is set in the ways that I just feel are wrong, and it's going to be a battle. I'm in the minority. What can I do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really the question, I think. What can I do legitimately when, certainly in the current structures in the current system, everything seems kind of stacked against me? I think part of it starts very simply with those gathering of like-minded people, of building of that kind of community within a community, of that kind of fellowship. It sounds almost banal to say, but I am constantly reminded of the importance of the face-to-face encounter, just having coffee with people and building up the fellowship that way, and then beginning to organize. I think one of the downfalls of the social media age is that we think that politics just involves shouting at somebody on Twitter, rather than, no, you're going to be sitting, on some folding chairs in a parish hall basement somewhere, drinking bad coffee for a while you plot, what you have to do. That's politics. You got to organize. You got to talk. You got to go to meetings. It takes time. It takes effort. And slowly spread the message for people that it doesn't have to be this way. We can do things in other ways. And I think particularly if bishops today realize that people are serious about major reform, they're eventually going to wake up and follow. Particularly, I think, if people start to say, well, we're just not going to support you until we have a major accounting, right? We're not going to be sending money. We're not going to be putting our kids in your schools. We are not going to be doing these kinds of things until we start to see some major changes. And to the extent that the church has changed in the past, in times of major crisis, it's eventually the bishops getting caught up to where the people are and saying, we can either get in front of this or we can get run over by it, but we're going to have to do something. So I think, the meeting, the talking, the coffee, the dinner, and slowly looking for openings to sort of say, well, we can push a bit in this direction and we can make some changes here. And doing so, I think, people have to do it in a way that makes it clear we're not here as the Committee of Public Safety in the French Revolution to start cutting heads off. We're here to do it because we love you. We love the church. We love priests and bishops. We love you enough to hold you accountable. We love you enough to want to help you because we know that you've got too much of a burden right now. We're not here to shove you aside. And so I think if people really come out with a graciousness in their demeanor and attitude, and a kind of a cheerfulness and a gentleness and so on, that in itself, I think, is significant in helping people to say, oh, okay, these people aren't just here to try and run me out of town. They're really here because they do, even with all my faults, they do love me as the bishop or the pastor. I think we know this from our own experience, right? We're much more inclined to listen to somebody who makes his or her love for us manifest than somebody who's angry and, as you say, waving a finger all the time and chastising. So I think a lot of it does come to that basic gracious community building and organization.
I'm going to suggest something here. Thank you. That's terrific. And I'm going to suggest something here in addition, or as a detail, really, of what we're saying. And that is that where I am, we have a little group that gets together every Monday. We did our first Twitter live stream, actually. 25 people viewed. I don't know what that means. But we sing Vespers.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
And we're I'm gathering anyone who's interested. It's just me. And so there's 5 or 6 of us, and not everybody turns up every week. But we're learning to chant it. We're doing it in English. We're basing it on the Anglican Ordinariate.
Okay.
And we have our way of doing it, which is actually informed by what I've seen in the Eastern liturgy. So it tends to be very straightforward singing. It's not. I can't describe this without it sounding negative, but it's not an effective
yes.
voice, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great things you notice when you go to Eastern liturgies, people are singing in ordinary voices as an ordinary pace. So we use that manner, and it has a sort of masculine feel to it that actually is inclusive to men and women. And we just do that, and we create, and it does create community. Now, that is nourished by the masses we go to and the liturgies we go to on Sunday in separate places, all of us. None of us are actually in the same church. And we come together, and presumably then it transforms us supernaturally by degrees in ways which we're not aware when we go back to the parish. And those habits of worship, which we are in full control of in that liturgy, we're going to take those into the parish setting and just be an example in a different sort of way. And so I think the domestic church is where the laity have full control. So let's exercise that control and build up communities. And you attach it to a dinner, and then suddenly this becomes something that is social. And we also, I live in what's a converted convent, actually, where somebody took the lease and lets rooms out to people. It's a great system. It's wonderful.
Nice.
But we get together every Sunday, and gradually I encourage us to sing the Our Father. We're some different backgrounds, and we do that every time. And so then those people were primed. Some from here go to this Vespers every Monday that we do. And so you can see that little by little, people are changing in the way that they're participating in the liturgy. At this point, it has nothing to do with any priest or any parish in terms of its inspiration, shall we say. But we hope that then we're taking that back to our communities. And suddenly the Sunday worship does seem like the focus. However, whatever form it is, this is the central force that is informing everything else. You feel it in just in the way that you carry out the liturgy. If that makes any sense to you.
It does, and it's striking how much of a parallel there is to a group I was involved with in Canada 15 years ago. In a Ukrainian parish up there that started doing the same thing with Saturday night Vespers. And then it grew into a little series of talks afterwards, and then it was like, well, why don't we have dinner together, and discovering friendships, and then, so-and-so's kid is sick, we're going to help them out with that, and that kind of community within a community. And I think that's absolutely the way to go. And it even if it doesn't necessarily translate into a huge major reform in the church, it, as you say so well, it it changes people internally, and that is in itself no small thing.
Yes, that's really interesting to hear. That's exactly what I'm hoping will happen. One thing connects with another.
Yeah.
And we don't know the effect that it's having on others.
Right. Yeah.
Engenders a sort of humility because we're not campaigning.
Yes.
And the other thing is, it's not a threat to anybody. We're just doing it. And no one can, is going to worry about us doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, Adam, this has been wonderful for me.
Yes, thank you. For me too. Yeah.
You having read the book, and I'm just going to wish you well and say goodbye. And I hope our paths cross again in the very near future.
I should like that very much. All right. Well, thank you again. Okay.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you are interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.